Okay, hello everybody. So we are moving on into ancient Greece. Last time we had the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, the original Greek Bronze Age civilizations that eventually collapsed under mysterious circumstances. Some say some kind of war, possibly a lot of other factors as well. And what we're going to do now in this class is we're going to move on into archaic Greece. So this is one of the different time periods of Greece. Um, but we're going to sort of go past the end of the Bronze Age into what you might call the early Iron Age or even the Dark Age, and then into archaic Greece. And then we'll finally reach the sort of more famous Greeks with what we call classical Greece. But I'm going to pull up that timeline here in a second so that we can discuss all of this and get that nailed down a little bit more. But the different time periods in Greece, we're moving away from the Bronze Age and into a new age where the Bronze Age has fallen apart. So the Greeks are going to have to pull themselves back up out of that situation. Now, as usual, it's only a problem if you really like the things that we like: big buildings, lots of writing, um, lots of sort of knowledge and records and stuff like that. That is the kind of stuff that goes away at the end of the Bronze Age, and cities go away at the end of the Bronze Age. It doesn't necessarily mean that life was any better or worse for your average farmer. There simply stopped being a king who could tell them where to take their crops. But eventually, their populations did start growing again, and you ended up with the more familiar Greek culture. But let's dig into that. And actually, what I want to do first is do something I wasn't able to do before, which is show you Greece on Google Earth. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. So here we are in North America. Let's make our usual journey over to the Mediterranean here. As you can probably guess, Mediterranean is going to be quite important throughout this class. So here's our favorite sort of sea between all these continents here. And so we had Egypt over here, we had Mesopotamia over here, and now we are getting into Greece right over here. So here's the island of Crete where the Minoans were from, and here's the sort of main area of Greece where the Mycenaeans were from, what I guess you could call the Greek mainland. But as you can see, there's quite a lot of islands as well, and this region here is known as the Aegean Sea. And over on the east, we've got what's known as the Ionian coast, which eventually leads to Turkey. In the Bronze Age, it led to the Hittites. Later on, it's going to lead to the Persian Empire, and we'll be discussing the Persian Empire today. Okay, but that should ground you in sort of the basics of Greece. Egypt's not too far away over here, and the Greeks interacted with Egypt a lot, increasingly as time went on. And then this is really where the action is. Athens is over here. Actually, I think it might be up over here, yeah. While Sparta is down over here. And those are going to be important cities for the later Greek civilization. But we'll get into all that. For now, let's think about how the Greeks emerged out of their Dark Age. So let me switch over to the PowerPoint here. So Dark Age, it's a little bit of a misleading term in ways. We hear the term Dark Age, we think, negative, really bad. It was a bad time to be alive. But like I said, life probably didn't change that much for your average farmer. What Dark Age also is sometimes used to mean is a time period that is dark to historians. We can't see it. And usually the reason that is because we have less writing in this time period. And the old Mycenaean form of writing, Linear B, has gone away. And the Greeks don't appear to have one right now, or if they do, it's not very common. So that is a big part of why the time period is dark to us. But it's a little bit misleading to say that because it sort of implies negativity. So sometimes people just call it the Iron Age instead. And like I said, the end of the famous civilizations at this time period falls pretty nicely coinciding with when people go from using bronze tools to iron tools in this region. And the reason they do that is because they finally figure out how to make a fire hot enough. I think it's like something like 1,000 degrees to be able to melt iron. So that's pretty cool. Okay, so now we are entering into this age of iron. And I should mention these little abbreviations here. The 12th century means the 1100s, and the 5th century means the 400s, and so on and so forth. The reason for this is, if you think about what is the first century, well, the first century is 100 to 0 or 0 to 100. So then the second century is going to be 200 to 100, basically. So it gets a little confusing, but I just wanted to mention that because it's something that might have come up in the textbook and in our class a couple of times, this idea of the centuries. But yeah, that's why we are living in the 21st century despite living in the 2000s. The other little thing I wanted to mention is this abbreviation C, or sometimes we'll see CA. So that means about, approximately. It's an abbreviation for the Latin word circa, which means about. This is where we're talking in terms of centuries, not really being able to nail things down to a specific date, but about the 1100s onward. And that makes sense with what we learned about when the end of the Bronze Age was and when the end of those civilizations was. Okay, but just like you might expect in the Iron Age, we have iron tools. Yay, hooray. We start seeing evidence of this, and these are pretty badly corroded, probably because we found them in a shipwreck. But you see, iron spears and iron armor, using iron to hitch your wagons together and have your oxes pull your crops, which is more important for your average farmer. Lots of good iron tools. They're sturdier, they're more reliable, and bonus, iron is everywhere. So once you figure out how to melt it, it's pretty useful. Okay, so what do we see of, civilization? And by that, I kind of mean not necessarily something better, but just the things that we care about, cities and monuments and whatnot. We only see the slightest evidence for this during this time period, which is so dark to us. One of the things that we see certain archaeological sites. One of the most interesting ones is a place called Lefkandi. We found a settlement that was built around 900. And what we had was this long building that's sort of rectangular. And we found some cool stuff like this centaur statue in here. And we don't really know what all of that is about. But one theory that people have is that this might represent the very earliest version of a Greek temple. It's got sort of rough wooden columns around on the outside. Well, later we're going to have Greek temples that are rectangles with columns around on the outside like this, only they're marble, like so. It seems like, Minoans and Mycenaeans invented the use of columns in that way. But then these guys are inventing sort of the temple design. So that's pretty cool. But for the most part, we don't have too much detail. We just have some interesting things like artifacts like this. We don't know if this is a toy, if this has a religious role, but it's cool to see one of the first centaurs in mythology in recorded history. Generally, historians talk about a period they call the geometric period. And this is because we mostly know these folks from their grave sites, from their tombs, because that's the kind of stuff that lasts after everything else is gone. But they don't seem to have built like giant stone monuments or anything like that, but they did have a lot of tombs. And so we see some really cool stuff on these tombs and on these pots that we find in these tombs. These guys are working with pottery and making some really cool art, and we call it the geometric period because there's such a clear interest in these patterns, these geometric designs. And that's most of what we know about them. They have these really cool designs on their pottery, but they're able to depict very stylized human figures. This one appears to be a funeral. Maybe it's a funeral from mythology, but you've got someone who's dead and you've got a family kind of wailing around the dead person. And that's a zoom in on over here. You've also got these horses, which are pulling chariots. And the chariots are carrying people with these sort of figure-8 shaped shields. So we have a little bit of a sense of like battle and stuff like that. Chariots being very important for war. So yeah, just a glimpse into this kind of stuff is pretty cool. Another funeral scene over here, again with those geometric designs. Yep, I think this is another view of the same one. After this geometric period, we move into what people call the Archaic period. And Archaic period in Greece is basically the 700s to the start of the 400s, or the end of the 500s, however you want to say it. And this Archaic period, sometimes people talk about the Orientalizing period, meaning mainly that this is a time period where Greeks are picking up art styles from Mesopotamia, from the East. That's originally what Oriental means. Nowadays, it's not a term people would use so much, but the historians who noticed this defined it as this time period where Greeks are picking up art ideas from the East and getting a little bit more detailed. And you can see the detail in the vase painting is evolving quite significantly. These horses and these human figures are a lot better fleshed out, but we still have shields. You know, it's important to depict people going off to battle and stuff like that. And this may connect to mythology in ways we don't fully understand. But okay, I've thrown a lot of dates at you. Let's look at a timeline here. So the Minoans, you could basically say 1600s to 1200s. But around the 1400s, they basically get taken over by the Mycenaeans. So you could list them as 1600s to 1400s instead, because they're not really in power after the 1400s. But everybody goes away around 1100. Like I said, the great collapse that we don't know as much about as we would like. And then we enter into this Dark Ages period, this time period where knowledge is lost to us, which corresponds pretty well with the start of this Iron Age. And where with the Bronze Age, we can pretty much put it from the earliest stuff around the 3500s to the 1100s. And then Archaic Greece is usually thought of as the 700s onward. And I won't make you worry about geometric or orientalizing or anything like that. Just knowing about the Archaic time period is pretty significant. And where you draw the lines on these time periods depends on which historians you ask. So just know that it's a rough classification. The important thing is that the Mycenaeans disappeared. The Greeks entered into an Iron Age, and then in climbing out of that, when this first started happening, when cities first started becoming big again, that started in this Archaic period. And then classical Greece, the classical period, is kind of the height of Greek culture, what people think of as the coolest and best stuff, and when they build a lot of awesome monuments. And the classical time period, we can start, most people usually start at 480. And there's a very specific reason for that. And that's because it has something very specific to do with the Persian Wars. These Persian Wars, that's what the Greeks called them. We could maybe more accurately call them the Greco-Persian Wars, because the Greeks saw them as the wars with the Persians, but the Persians saw them as the wars with the Greeks. Or maybe, I don't even know what they thought of the Greeks necessarily, because most of our information comes from the Greeks looking at Persians, not the other way around. Eventually we'll get into the Peloponnesian War, but right now we're looking at the Persian Wars. But there's some stuff that happens in the Archaic period that we're going to look at first. Yeah, okay, I'm going to stop the video there, and we'll pick up with the Archaic period and moving into the Persian Wars.